Hello and welcome to Wathan Creations. Today we're sculpting a broken robot at the end of humanity, facing what has been lost. Our little robot starts out with some suitably robotic aluminum bones, with the hips and chest bulked out with some mildly cubed aluminum foil. This both sets the foundation for the clay layers and cuts down on the amount of clay in this sculpture. For the eyes, I'll add some glowing LEDs to the front of the head. Instead of trying to hide the wiring, I decided to embrace it as part of the sculpture, letting them flow naturally as part of the robot's design. Then I can start adding the first layers of clay, starting with the neck. A key challenge with this sculpture was trying to make the robot look like it can actually move and function, such as with the segmented neck, and other bits and bobs placed to give it that extra layer of realism. That being said, one of the main ideas I had for this lonesome robot is that after the fall of humanity, it was left to repair itself, slowly adding bits of found scrap metal to their body layer by layer as they slowly rust and fall apart, inevitably being consumed back into the earth. One thing you'll see me doing a lot with this sculpture is layering pieces, textures, and details to give the illusion of depth, making you imagine that the robot is machined throughout instead of just having an aluminum core. I would definitely like to say that I planned this all out, but to be honest it was mostly trial and error, winging the whole thing piece by piece. The astute among you might even see pieces disappear and reappear or change between scenes. That's just where I've gone in and changed bits that didn't really work with the flow of the design. After an initial bake, I discovered that my LEDs didn't actually light up, so I had to tear them out and rewire the face. Honestly, this was a bit of a blessing in disguise, since my layout for the second iteration turned out a lot better for the facial structure I had in mind. For the eyes, I'm using green LEDs, which is a nod to some of the dystopian natural elements I'll incorporate later on. A symbol of how everything is inevitably reclaimed by the land beneath. I wanted the face to be blank and smooth, with an almost animalistic shape, like a little raccoon or a mouse, to help convey a sense of innocence. I didn't want it to seem like this robot is evil, or that it was even necessarily the cause of humanity's extinction. At this point, it's just here, watching, slowly rusting into oblivion. A quick test to make sure my LEDs still work, and we're on to the body. I'll coat the torso in clay, then start building up the layers and layers of detail, starting with the rubber waist so that the robot can bend. And then I'll immediately add some strips of metal to make that movement impossible. At one point, this robot probably had an outer shell or body that gave it some defined shape and protected it from the elements. But either through disaster, war, or neglect, clearly that outer shell is no more, and we're left to see the poorly repaired innards, plate by plate, disc by disc. Much of this was an exercise in the mantra of trust the process, where I had to keep adding bits and pieces with the confidence that in the end it would look complete and not like utter garbage. Well, should look a bit like garbage. But the hope is that it looks like intentional garbage. The other main exercise for me, however, was to not add too much. Knowing where to stop with the detail is tricky, and especially when each piece covers up parts of another, it's important to think about how the sculpture will look as a whole, as well as in each individual section. Overall, the torso was a lot easier to figure out compared to the arms and legs, partly because the slender surfaces make adding mechanical detail a lot more tricky, at least for me. For the body, I could just slap some tubes, vents, knobs, and bits of scrap metal on all willy-nilly and call it a day. The arms are definitely a different story, and I relied heavily on the wire armature itself to take the place of clay in some parts. I did my best, though, to cram as much detail as I could in a small space, making dials and buttons and panels that, at some point in the distant past, had some sort of use. My vision for the arms was to have them be lanky and long, dangling past the waistline. Definitely disproportionate compared to the legs. The robot's right arm is torn apart and exploded shortly after the elbow. I wanted the robot to have lost something more than just movement and spare parts. A dismemberment of an entire arm, especially in a violent explosion, felt perfect to contrast from the relative peacefulness of the rest of the sculpture. The left arm is similar to the right, but distinctly different in terms of detail and lack of explodedness. The robot is asymmetrical partly due to its original design. Perhaps the arms held different purposes or capabilities. They're also different though because of the robot's manual repairs, using whatever scrap bits of metal they could find, regardless of how it looked or fit. The fingers start out as a thin wire armature positioned to grip a small and delicate object. I'm not sure exactly how small this object will be at this point though, so I decided to make the fingers fully positionable by adding little tubes of clay one at a time to the fingers, leaving the joints bare so that the wire can bend between. Then with that done, I'm finally onto the legs. These followed a similar blueprint to the arms, but with more large blocks of metal for stability. I decided to make the feet lopsided so that the right is about half the size of the left, as if one is wearing a shoe and the other is bare. More likely though, the robot just used some scrap parts that didn't quite fit, making do with what they could find. This is the apocalypse after all. Can't be picky when choosing feet now, can we? After a quick bit of alcohol brushing to remove any pesky fingerprints, I'll give the sculpture a final bake, and then start adding some damage. To show that this isn't a pristine robot fresh out of the factory, I'll use some files to add some scratches, cracks, and miscellaneous wear and tear, all of which will get picked up in the painting. Speaking of which, this robot is a little bit gray. Let's prime them silver. For the paint scheme, I wanted to go with a mishmash of metallics with contrasting spots of deep black and bright red to break up the visuals. The color scheme was also inspired by some solar punk influences, adding some metallic greens, blues, and browns to give the robot a more nature-influenced scheme. Since the pieces all overlap, I had to paint from the inside out, so that if I accidentally painted outside the lines on an inner part, I could just touch it up when I painted the next layers. It was really satisfying watching the patchwork quilt of colors and textures come alive in this process, as the sculpture finally started to feel more complete. I always go through this phase when I'm making these things where I start to feel like, this is terrible, what am I thinking? And then the painting comes together and my brain calms down to, this isn't too bad. I think the important thing to remember when you're making stuff and trying new things is to just put in some good effort and understand that no one is perfect, and the whole point is to keep creating and having fun. Without going full steampunk, I felt like the coppers and tins gave the robot an aged and antique look. I wanted the robot to be futuristic, but also somehow ancient, having been around for decades or even centuries after the apocalypse and the fall of humanity. And so to emphasize that point, I'll give the entire sculpture a watery black acrylic wash to sink into all the recesses and add some tarnishing to the metallic paint. This also helps emphasize a lot of the texture from the sculpting process, deepening each bolt, rivet, and carved line. After each pass with the wash, I'll dab away the excess with a scrap of paper towel to make sure that the paint doesn't pool and obscure the detail. In retrospect, I think it could have gone a little bit heavier with the aging on this part, but oh well. To brighten up some of the edges and add some easy scuffy weathering, I'll dry brush the whole thing with silver paint. This also homogenized the different colors, bringing them all a little bit more together. Back to making the robot look very badly aged, I'll use a faint brownish wash and some bright orange paint to add some simple rust effects to choice locations on the panels, emphasizing the scratches, gashes, and gaps where water might collect, causing the metal to corrode. I think whomever built this robot in the first place did well enough to ensure that the majority of the metals were rust-proof, but clearly they didn't do enough. Next, to make it seem as if the violence of the unwilling amputation is long past but still very visible, I'll add some heavy rusting to the open arm nub, and dry brush the burned edges with a heavy black dry brushing. As the final touch, I'll use some eyeshadow powder from my partner's makeup, which I'll apply to choice locations on the robot's body to make the metal look dusty and aged. Pastel powders probably would be better in the future, but this is what I could scavenge for now, so it'll have to do. This all gets sealed with some matte varnish, and now we can make the base. The base starts off as a disc of wood covered in liquid clay so that the subsequent layers adhere to the wood. My vision is to have the robot standing on a tiny hill of dirt, staring at the weathered bones of a species long gone. Our ribs and other bones get pressed into the clay, followed by a little dead tree stump, and then an old corroded drainage pipe. The main feature, however, is the human skull, which starts out as an egg of clay with a little jaw, quickly interrupted by a furry visitor. Oh, hi. What are you doing here? Alright, here we go. I'm definitely no anatomy expert, but with some reference images at hand, I was able to poke and prod my way into a halfway decent looking skull. The main thing I had issues with were the teeth, but let's just pretend that over the centuries these got a little bit extra decayed, which is why they look kinda wonky. Definitely not my fault. Since only the front half of the skull will be visible, I'll lop off the back and stick them in place. Then I can add my rocky sand around the bones to give the base some earthy dirt texture, which can also hide some of the gaps where I pressed each piece into the clay below. After this is all baked, to hide the battery pack for the robot's eyes, I'll carve a secret doorway into the mound and pull out the tinfoil innards to create a little hollow. This hid the battery pack a lot better than I anticipated. The whole base then gets primed in a bone white, and I can start painting, beginning with the shining metal drain pipe. Then I'll go on to the rest of the landscape, coating it with a series of brown, green, and black washes, blending them together until I have a slightly marshy looking pile of earth. To give the scene a sense of age, I'll give the bones a sepia wash, followed by a faint white dry brushing to highlight the edges and bring back some of the bony color. Although it's a little melancholy, I wanted to emphasize that there is life in this fictional apocalyptic scene. So to lighten everything, I added some choice pieces of short and tall grass, giving the entire area a marshy vibe, followed by a sprinkling of fallen leaves to tie it all together. Naturally, this isn't the apocalypse without another remnant of humanity, so I'll add a tiny non-brand specific soda can as well. Then we can add our robot, solder the wires together, and close the secret doorway. I still felt like the landscape was a bit too bland, so I added some scuffs of moss to the base and the robot, which is just made of some green flocking and Mod Podge. Then to enhance the sense of decay, I'll heavily rust the pipes and can, leaking down into the dirt below. As the penultimate touch, I'll add a squirt of water effects to make some tiny puddles in the mud, and then mix up some dirty UV resin sludge to drip out of the pipe. Last but not least, held in the robot's fingers, I'll add a tiny homemade flower, an offering in remembrance of all that has been lost. I hope you enjoyed seeing this little robot, silent observer to what once was, not just a machine, but the sole keeper of memories. Huge thank you to my patrons on Patreon for helping support this channel, keeping weird creations coming your way. If you liked the video, consider subscribing. This channel turns 1 year old next week, which is just wild to think about. It's been such a blast, and I'm excited for what's to come. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you next time.